The morning at Alaric Strategic Holdings started like any other, cold, clinical, and painfully quiet. The 30th floor of the glass-walled tower was a sanctuary of power and precision, where every surface gleamed and every sound was muffled by the sheer weight of control. People moved efficiently, but never quickly, afraid to attract attention, especially the attention of the man behind the opaque office door at the end of the executive wing. That door, black with a gold nameplate that read R. Alaric, was more of a symbol than a barrier. It meant silence. It meant authority. It meant that if you had to be called in, you either were about to be rewarded beyond imagination or removed like a stain. No one looked directly at it unless they had a reason. Zadie Wynn never had a reason. She had worked at Alaric Holdings for 10 months and 17 days. She knew because she counted everyone. Not out of dread, but out of necessity. Every job before this one had been temporary. Too loud, too male, too invasive. Here, though, the pressure was immense, the walls were clean. Boundaries were respected. Expectations were clear. It was the first time she'd ever worked somewhere that let her keep her head down without punishing her for it. She liked that. She lived in silence. It was the only language that had never been weaponized against her. Her job as a junior data analyst was tedious to some. Spreadsheets, forecasts, endless reports. But to her, it was clarity. Patterns made sense. Data didn't lie. Unlike people. She sat at her assigned desk, third row from the windows, her fingers moving steadily across the keyboard, her attention so focused she barely noticed when the room hushed even more than usual. A presence entered, the kind that didn't require introduction. She didn't need to look up to know who had walked into the department. Everyone else had gone still. Rowan Alaric didn't make appearances on the lower floors, not unless there was a crisis or a purge. She glanced up for a second and caught only the edge of his frame. A charcoal gray suit cut with surgical precision, black shoes polished to mirror finish, and a face that looked like it had never known rest. She had seen him before, of course. From a distance, he was unavoidable. Forbes, GQ, Financial Times. The billionaire who built an empire from nothing by the age of 35. The man who didn't smile in photographs. The man who didn't blink when cutting entire divisions. He passed by without acknowledging anyone, heading straight for the conference room at the far end. Behind him followed his second-in-command, Marcus Ellison, silent as always. "When?" a voice said suddenly. Zadie turned to see her manager, Leah, standing at her side with a clipboard and the look of someone trying not to panic. "You're needed in the conference room, now." Zadie blinked. "Me?" Leah didn't repeat herself. She simply nodded toward the hallway and then stepped back. Zadie's first thought was that she was being let go. Her second thought was that she hadn't done anything wrong. Her third was that none of that mattered. You didn't question a direct summons from the executive floor. You went. Quietly. The glass doors to the conference room opened as she approached, and Marcus motioned her inside. The room was sleek and vast, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying view of Manhattan. At the far end of the table, Rowan sat with one arm resting on the leather chair, his gaze fixed on a file in front of him. He didn't look up when she entered. "Sit," Marcus said, gesturing to the seat across from him. She obeyed, adjusting the hem of her blouse and trying to keep her breathing steady. She didn't fidget. She didn't ask questions. She waited. Rowan finally lifted his eyes, and the intensity in them was like being pinned under a spotlight. Gray, sharp, unreadable. He studied her for a long moment, not leering, not even curious, just analyzing. "I've read your reports," he said. "The last 3 quarters. You modeled a 12% deviation in the Farron sector. You were the only one who accounted for the drop." Her voice didn't shake when she answered. "I cross-referenced upstream volatility with pre-market currency rates in emerging regions. The dip was inevitable." He nodded once. Everyone else missed it. She didn't respond. She wasn't sure if she was supposed to. "I need someone on a private project," he continued. "It's high level, isolated, requires discretion." "Why me?" she asked before she could stop herself. It wasn't defiance, it was confusion. She was aware of her place in the hierarchy. She was not the kind of person summoned to private meetings, let alone offered elite assignments. Rowan didn't answer right away. He leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing. Because you're invisible, he said. You don't chase attention. You don't make noise. And you see what no one else does. Zadie felt something tighten in her chest. A compliment? A threat? A warning? I won't sign anything unethical, she said calmly. A corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, more like a tick of interest. Good, he replied. You start tomorrow. She stood, but before she could leave, his voice stopped her. One more thing, Miss Wynne. She turned. Don't speak to Gray Maddox. If he reaches out, inform Marcus immediately. Her brow furrowed. I don't know who that is. Let's keep it that way. That was the end of the conversation. She walked back to her desk in silence, her mind racing. No one asked her questions when she returned, but Ivy raised a brow from the next pod over. Zadie didn't answer. Not yet. She wasn't sure she had answers. But she knew one thing. Rowan Alaric had noticed her. And that somehow terrified her more than anything. Zadie didn't sleep the night after her unexpected meeting with Rowan Alaric. The memory of his voice, cold and controlled, replayed in her head like a scratched vinyl record. She lay awake long after the city lights faded behind the blinds of her small apartment, her body motionless beneath the blanket, while her mind tried to dissect every word he had said. He wanted her for a private project. He called her invisible. And then he had warned her, directly and without a trace of warmth, not to speak to a man she'd never even met. There was something about the way he said it, something that suggested it wasn't just business. She tried to rationalize it, tried to fit it into the clinical framework of her job, but the truth was, Rowan Alaric had noticed her, and that alone was enough to unsettle everything she thought she understood about her place in the company. The next morning was crisp and unusually quiet for downtown Manhattan. The elevators in the Alaric Holdings Tower opened to the executive floor with a soft mechanical chime, and Zadie stepped out into a world entirely unlike the one she had known on the lower levels. There was no chatter, no idle movement. Everything was still. Each piece of furniture seemed chosen not just for function, but for message. Sleek, sharp, intimidating. She passed polished glass walls, her reflection appearing and disappearing with every step. It felt like walking through a gallery of power. Marcus Ellison met her outside an unmarked office just a few doors down from the CEO's. He offered her no greeting, just a nod and a key card. This space is yours for the duration of the project, he said. Confidentiality is assumed. No one else will have access. The office was minimal to the point of starkness. White walls, steel desk, ergonomic chair, 2 monitors already lit, and a slim stack of files placed perfectly parallel at the center. There was no art, no clock, no welcome. It was not designed for comfort. It was designed for focus, for control. Marcus left without another word. Zadie sat down and opened the top file. She expected internal financial reports. What she found instead was an entire dossier on a company called Hollinger Dynamics. At first glance, it looked like a standard portfolio entity, but the deeper she read, the clearer it became that something was wrong. Very wrong. The numbers were too clean, some too dirty. Several invoices didn't match up with declared goods. Vendors appeared for a single transaction, then vanished without a trace. The patterns were subtle, ingeniously so. But they were there. Someone was siphoning money. Hours passed without her realizing. She moved from file to file, constructing a silent web of deceit, unspoken, unrecorded, almost perfectly buried. She didn't look at the clock. She didn't check her phone. The only sound in the office was the hum of electricity and the clicking of her keyboard. The door opened without warning. Rowan entered, dressed in another immaculate suit, his presence hitting the room like a shift in the atmospheric pressure. He didn't greet her. He simply stepped forward, his eyes moving from her face to the monitors and back again. What do you see? He asked. Zadie didn't hesitate. Someone is moving money through fake vendors. They're hiding transactions inside foreign currency exchange reports. The shell companies are registered in jurisdictions where corporate ownership can't be traced. Rowan's expression didn't change. How high does it go? Too high, she said. 3 executives are definitely involved, possibly more. They're either complicit or stupid. I'm betting on complicit, he replied flatly. He moved to the edge of her desk and leaned one hand against it, never taking his eyes off her. Keep going, he said. Don't stop until you've mapped every person who touched this. Zadie nodded slowly. What happens when I do? Rowan's voice dropped half a tone, quieter but more deliberate. Then I remove them. She didn't flinch, but she noticed the way he watched her, like he was testing how far she could be pushed before breaking, like he wanted to see if she would. Why me? She asked again. Why not hire someone with experience in forensic accounting or legal risk? Because they talk, he said. You don't. That's not the same as trust. No, he said. It's better. He turned to leave, but paused at the door. One more thing. If anyone outside this floor asks what you're working on, tell them it's a feasibility report for a future investment. If they press, report it. Even if it's just a question? She asked. Rowan looked back at her, his eyes unreadable. Especially if it's just a question. When he left, the office felt colder than before. Zadie sat still for a long time, staring at the empty doorway. She had been recruited for a job she hadn't applied for, handed a level of access she hadn't earned, and warned about people she hadn't even met. It wasn't paranoia. It was calculated caution. But beneath the professionalism, there was something else in Rowan's voice when he spoke to her. Something unspoken, protective, territorial. She didn't know, and she wasn't sure she wanted to find out. By the end of the day, she had traced 7 additional flag transactions and began building a profile of the executives involved. She didn't leave until after sunset. The executive floor was almost deserted when she walked out, her heels echoing softly on the marble tiles. No one stopped her. No one asked what she was doing, and yet she felt eyes following her all the way to the elevator. Back in her apartment that night, she stared out the window into the glittering sprawl of the city and felt a strange sensation curling beneath her skin. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was something else, something dangerous, something personal. And Rowan Alaric, whether he admitted it or not, had just drawn a line around her. She didn't know what that meant yet, but she would. Soon, Zadie arrived at the office earlier than usual the next morning, stepping off the elevator into a space that still felt like it hadn't woken up yet. The executive floor was dim, lit only by the soft glow of track lights that outlined the hallways. The silence here had a different quality. It wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of control. Everything in the space seemed to wait for Rowan Alaric's arrival, as if the air itself paused in anticipation of his presence. She moved quietly through the corridor and into her assigned office, dropping her coat on the chair and immediately pulling up the encrypted files she had been working on the night before. What she had uncovered in 2 days was already dangerous. Hollinger Dynamics wasn't just laundering money. They were doing it through charities. Registered nonprofit foundations, supposedly based in regions that no longer existed as independent entities. The names on the ledgers were linked to people who had no digital fingerprints outside of these transactions. Shells within shells. The brilliance of the fraud made her stomach turn. It wasn't desperation. It was greed executed by people who were confident they'd never be caught. She hadn't spoken a word of it to anyone, not even Ivy, who had texted her late last night asking if she'd vanished. She didn't answer. She couldn't. She was deep in tracing a currency trail from Croatia to Singapore when a figure passed by her door. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Seconds later, the glass door opened and Rowan stepped inside. He didn't knock. He never did. He held a paper cup of coffee in his hand, which she thought was strange because she'd never actually seen him eat or drink anything. He set it on the corner of her desk wordlessly, not asking if she wanted it. I reviewed your report, he said. It's better than what I've gotten from people twice your age and with 10 times your title. Thank you, she said, sitting back and studying him. But compliments make me nervous. They should, he replied. They mean I'm expecting more. He circled to the other side of her desk and glanced at the wall-mounted screen where she had the visual network of the transactions displayed. Thin white lines stretched from one name to another, like an electronic spiderweb. He stared at it for a moment, then folded his arms. You think they're working alone? He asked. No, she said. There's someone higher, someone in our circle. These people don't have the brains or the balls to run this kind of laundering. They're middlemen. We're missing the center. Rowan was silent for a moment. Then he spoke with an edge of something that resembled admiration. Though it was so carefully controlled, it barely registered as human. You've read everyone in this company better than most of my board. I'm not reading them, she said, shaking her head. I'm watching them lie. He looked at her differently then. Not in the way a man looks at a woman, but in the way a hunter might look at a rival predator. Someone just as skilled, just as silent, just as dangerous. He didn't say it, but something passed between them. Recognition. That afternoon, Zadie was called into her first official meeting as part of the special division. The room was filled with executives she had only ever passed in hallways, their names floating through office gossip like untouchable royalty. She sat at the far end, unannounced and unnoticed at first, until Rowan entered and the entire room shifted. He didn't say hello. He didn't greet anyone. He simply walked to the head of the table, nodded towards Zadie and said, "She'll be taking the lead on internal audits. You'll report through her, then to me." The silence that followed was almost loud. Zadie felt dozens of eyes on her, all processing, all recalculating her presence. She knew they were wondering who she had to be appointed by Rowan Alaric without warning or explanation. She kept her expression neutral, her back straight, and her voice steady when she began outlining her initial findings and audit schedule. No one interrupted her, though she saw more than one clenched jaw and narrowed eye. Gray Maddox entered 15 minutes late. He was taller than she expected, with a Hollywood smile and a perfectly tailored navy suit. He didn't apologize for the delay. He didn't look flustered. Instead, he walked in like he owned the room and dropped into the chair next to hers without asking. Rowan's gaze locked onto him immediately. There was a pause, just long enough to be intentional. "Gray," Rowan said with a voice flat and ice cold, "you're not on this team." "I'm a shareholder in Hollinger," Gray replied smoothly. "I have the right to hear what happens to my investments." Sadie felt the energy in the room shift. She didn't move, but her fingers curled slightly under the table. "Then listen," Rowan said, "but keep your hands off what's mine." It wasn't a slip. It wasn't an accidental choice of words. It wasn't about Hollinger. It was a warning, and everyone in the room heard it. Gray's smile didn't waver. He turned towards Zadie, leaned back in his chair, and said, "Well, it seems the invisible girl's finally found a spotlight. I'll try not to blind you." She turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes with a calm that came from surviving worse than smug men with sharp suits. "I work in the dark," she said. "Light's just noise." Someone coughed to hide a laugh. Gray's expression cooled just a bit, but he said nothing more for the rest of the meeting. Afterwards, as people filtered out, Rowan stood by the window with his back to the room. Zadie paused in the doorway, unsure if she should say anything. Then, as if sensing her hesitation, he spoke. "You held your own." She nodded once. "You set the tone." "I meant what I said to him," he added without turning around. "I know," she replied. "That's the problem." She left before he could respond. Her pulse was faster than she wanted to admit. Gray Maddox had taken one look at her and seen something he wanted, not for value but for leverage. And Rowan had made a claim that wasn't supposed to exist. What was unfolding between them wasn't clear. It wasn't labeled, but it was growing, and somewhere deep inside her, a truth began to settle. Rowan Alaric didn't share what he wanted. He protected it, relentlessly, quietly, entirely. The event was supposed to be simple. A corporate fundraiser held in one of Manhattan's most elite rooftop venues, under a canopy of string lights and velvet sky, filled with crystal glasses and rehearsed laughter. It was an obligation for most, a photo opportunity for others. For Zadie, it was her first time attending anything beyond a quiet strategy session or internal board update. She had almost declined the invitation outright. It came from Marcus, impersonal, like everything else he handed her, but with a handwritten addition at the bottom, "Strong presence recommended." She had stared at those 3 words for a long time. She knew whose handwriting it was. Sadie chose a dress that evening with the kind of calculation that only came from someone who had spent a life-building armor from clothing. It wasn't red or backless or laced. It was midnight blue, sharp at the neckline, clean at the seams, long-sleeved but form-fitting enough to define her without begging attention. Her hair was pulled into a low chignon. She wore no necklace, only small silver earrings and a matte lip. She didn't want to seduce the room. She wanted to own her space in it without apology. When she stepped into the event, escorted by a valet up to the glass elevator, she didn't hesitate at the threshold. The room buzzed with energy. Well-dressed men and women already a glass of champagne deep, speaking in whispers meant to be overheard. She could feel the eyes before they turned to place her. She wasn't unknown anymore. People noticed now. Some nodded politely, others studied her longer, and one of them, standing near the bar with a loosened tie and the unmistakable ease of entitlement, watched her like he'd been waiting all night. Gray Maddox made his way toward her slowly, weaving through the crowd like he owned the room. His smile was just as rehearsed as the rest of them, but there was an edge to it tonight, something darker lurking beneath the surface. He reached her before anyone else did, offering a glass of champagne with one hand and extending the other in greeting. "You clean up well, Miss Wynne," he said, eyes scanning her, not like he admired her, but like he was sizing her up. "I didn't think Alaric let his employees out in public." "I wasn't aware I needed his permission," Zadie replied, taking the glass but not a sip. Gray chuckled, stepping in just slightly closer. "That's the problem with him, isn't it? Everything is control, even the people he pretends not to care about." "I don't think he pretends anything," she said quietly, her voice steady. "He doesn't need to." Gray tilted his head, amused. "Interesting. You're more than sharp, I see. No wonder he's gone territorial." Zadie didn't answer. She simply turned to walk away, but Gray's hand brushed against her arm, just a casual touch, barely there. Still, it stopped her cold. "Let go," she said, her voice flat. But before she could move or escalate, another presence closed in. She didn't see him approach, but she knew instantly, by the change in the room's energy, by the stillness that followed, by the sudden and deliberate silence that surrounded them, that Rowan Alaric was behind her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't touch anyone, but the words came like a blade. "Touch her again," he said, "and you'll regret it." Every conversation around them slowed. A few eyes turned toward them discreetly, but most people kept their focus straight ahead, pretending they hadn't heard what they clearly had. Gray's hand dropped. He looked at Rowan without flinching, the easy smile still in place, but now colder. "Didn't realize she was yours." "She isn't," Rowan replied, "but that doesn't mean you get to pretend she is." Zadie exhaled softly through her nose, not because she was intimidated, but because she wasn't used to men defending her. Not like this. Not with ice instead of ego. Gray stepped back with a mocking bow. "As you wish, Alaric." Then he disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind a tension that lingered in the air like smoke. Rowan didn't speak for a long moment. He just stood beside her, scanning the room like he was trying to see who else might be watching. "You shouldn't be here alone," he finally said low. "I'm not," she replied. "Not anymore." He turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable. "He targeted you because of me." Zadie met his eyes. "No, he targeted me because he thought I wouldn't stop him." Rowan said nothing, but the look he gave her then, deep, controlled, careful, was not one she'd seen from him before. Not professional, not protective. It was something deeper, something personal, and maybe dangerous. "Don't mistake my silence for apathy," he said. "If he crosses a line again, I won't stay quiet." Zadie swallowed hard. "That's not your decision to make." "No," he said, "but it's my instinct." A moment passed, then another. She stepped back just slightly, putting space between them, but not enough to cut the connection. "You keep talking like I belong to someone," she said. "I don't." "I know," he replied. "That's what terrifies me." Zadie left the fundraiser 20 minutes later, walking alone to the street below and ignoring the offers of a car. Her heels clicked against the pavement in a slow, deliberate rhythm, but her mind was a mess of motion. Rowan Alaric had just crossed a line, and not one that involved policy or procedure. It was a line that separated men who command from men who care. And now that she'd seen what was on the other side, she wasn't sure who she was dealing with anymore. But part of her, the part that hadn't flinched under Gray's touch, the part that hadn't shaken when Rowan spoke, already knew the truth. She was no longer just part of his project. She was part of something else, something unfolding, something that might not end with numbers on a screen or names on a report, something that was becoming harder to deny. The office the following Monday morning felt like a different place entirely. There was a quiet undercurrent humming beneath the polished surface of the executive floor, as if some invisible line had been crossed and everyone was waiting to see the fallout. Zadie stepped out of the elevator dressed as she always was, professional, simple, clean. But today there was a weight pressing between her shoulders, a pressure that hadn't been there before. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anxiety. It was something heavier, a question without an answer. What exactly had changed between her and Rowan Alaric at that rooftop fundraiser? She had barely spoken to him since. He had left shortly after she did, and in the days that followed, their communication had been strictly professional. Cold even. Their meetings were efficient, their emails brief. No glances, no lingering tension. It was almost as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't stepped between her and Gray Maddox with the kind of steel-edged fury that made the entire room freeze, as if he hadn't said the words that still echoed in her mind every time she closed her eyes. Touch her again and you'll regret it. But Zadie hadn't forgotten, and she certainly hadn't misunderstood. That moment had not been business. It had not been strategy. It had been personal, raw, and unfiltered in a way that didn't match the man who ran billion-dollar deals without blinking. And now, whatever barrier had been keeping their dynamic professional had cracked, no matter how much they both tried to pretend otherwise. By mid-morning, she was deep into tracing a secondary network of shell companies when Marcus Ellison appeared at her door. He didn't knock, as usual, but his presence was always quiet, deliberate, like a shadow with a clipboard. "Mr. Alaric would like a word," he said simply. Zadie saved her work, stood, and followed Marcus down the corridor. But instead of the usual direction toward the executive conference room or her temporary office, he turned left, toward the private wing of the floor. She'd never been there before. It wasn't marked on any of the internal blueprints she'd seen. It wasn't even listed in the floor's access directory. Only 3 doors lined the corridor. Marcus stopped in front of the last one, keyed in a code, and stepped aside. "He's inside." Zadie stepped in slowly. The room was unlike anything else in the building. Dark wood paneling, shelves lined with books instead of awards, a leather couch, no windows, just low ambient lighting and a single painting on the wall. And there he was, Rowan, standing with his back to her, one hand resting on the edge of a desk that looked like it had been hand-carved a century ago. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "You defied a direct instruction." Zadie blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" "I told you not to engage with Gray Maddox," he said, turning to face her. His eyes were colder than she'd ever seen them. "And yet you let him approach you. You let him talk to you. You let him touch you." Zadie felt her chest tighten, not with guilt, with fury. "Let him? I wasn't exactly given a choice. You didn't stop him fast enough." Her eyes narrowed. "I didn't stop him fast enough for you." There was a long, dangerous silence. Then Rowan's jaw clenched. "You know what he's capable of. I warned you." "You don't get to dictate who speaks to me," she said, her voice low but firm. "You don't own me." "No," he said, stepping closer. "But I protect what's mine." "You just said I'm not." "Don't twist my words. I'm not twisting them. I'm holding them up to the light." Rowan stared at her, and for a moment the carefully constructed mask of power slipped. She saw something flicker in his expression, something uncertain, human. "I pulled you from the investigation," he said finally. The words hit her like ice. "What?" "You're off the Hollinger case, effective immediately. Because I didn't obey you? Or because you can't look at me without remembering that you stepped out of line?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence said everything. Zadie stepped back, trying to contain the storm building inside her. "You asked me to see what others ignore, to follow the truth, to stay quiet and move fast. I did everything you asked, and now you're punishing me for not staying invisible." "You were never invisible," he said softly. "That's the problem." She felt her throat tighten. Her pulse roared in her ears. She turned and walked out before she could say something she'd regret. The door closed behind her with a muted thud, and she didn't stop walking until she was back at her desk. She sat there breathing heavily, her hands trembling as she stared at her screen, now full of files she no longer had permission to access. By noon, the official notice came. Reassignment. She was to return to her previous department. A quiet removal, no explanation, no public scene. Just a gentle exile from a world she had briefly been invited into. Ivy appeared at her desk a few minutes later, holding 2 coffees and a frown. "You look like someone pulled the floor out from under you," she said. Zadie didn't answer. I heard rumors, Ivy added. Someone said Gray Maddox made a move on you. Another said Rowan nearly started a fistfight over it. That's ridiculous, right? Zadie looked at her, hollow and exhausted. Right. She left the building early that day. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. She didn't take the elevator to the top floor. She didn't check her email. She walked through the city as the afternoon sun dipped low between the buildings, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. She stopped at a bookstore, stayed there for an hour without touching a single title, then went home and sat in the dark for even longer. She had known this would happen the moment Rowan stepped between her and Gray. She had seen it in the way he looked at her, like a man who didn't want anything, but couldn't help it. And now she had become the very thing he couldn't tolerate. A weakness, a liability. But Zadie wasn't weak, and she wasn't going to let herself become collateral damage in someone else's war. She would find out the truth about Hollinger on her own, with or without his permission. And Rowan Alaric would learn that the woman he tried to protect wasn't one who could be pushed away. Not without a fight. For a full week, Zadie didn't hear from Rowan Alaric. Not a message, not a call, no sudden visits. It was as if he had decided to erase the chapter entirely, scrub her name from the margins of his carefully plotted empire, and file it away under irrelevant. She had been reassigned to her old department, back to the floor where no one met your eyes. And ambition was measured in silence. It should have felt like safety, familiarity, but it didn't. It felt like exile. Her desk was the same, the people were the same, but she wasn't, not anymore. She still woke every morning with purpose, but now it came with a bite. She hadn't stopped digging into Hollinger. She'd simply stopped doing it with a badge. Late at night, after hours, she accessed what little data she had copied and saved privately. Carefully, methodically, she followed the threads, building charts by hand, sketching timelines across her living room wall, printing records that she folded and hid between books. If they wanted her quiet, they'd underestimated the wrong woman. But it wasn't just work that haunted her. It was him, Rowan. The way he had looked at her in that private room, eyes cold, but voice so full of restraint it bordered on pain. You were never invisible. It hadn't been an accusation. It had been a confession. She tried to forget the way it made her feel. She tried to remind herself that what he had done, removing her from the case, cutting her out, was nothing more than damage control. But there were moments, always in the silence between things, where her heart still beat too fast at the memory of his voice, of the quiet intensity in the way he said her name. Then on a Wednesday afternoon, something shifted. She was reviewing a quarterly forecast on her monitor when a new email appeared. Unmarked, no subject, no sender. Just a line of text. The trail you're following isn't cold. It's burning. Be at 43 Barclay Street, 9 p.m. Come alone. No signature. No attachments. She stared at it for a long time. It could have been a trap. It could have been nothing. But something in her gut, the same instinct that had led her to uncover the truth about Hollinger, told her it was real. At 9 p.m., she stood outside the old building on Barclay Street. It was a forgotten structure nestled between two newer towers, its bricks weathered, its windows dark. She wore black jeans, a fitted coat, and kept her phone off. She didn't know what to expect. She wasn't scared. She was ready. Inside, the air was thick with dust and old heat. The lobby had no receptionist, just a flickering bulb above a stairwell. On the second floor, she found the door cracked open. And inside, Rowan Alaric. He stood by a table covered in files, dozens of them, lit only by a single lamp. His jacket was off, his sleeves rolled, and his expression unreadable. He didn't speak as she entered. He simply stepped aside, offering her space to see what he had gathered. This is everything I've been keeping out of the official system, he said at last, his voice rough from disuse. Records, wire transfers, names, everything the board never wanted found. Zadie approached slowly, flipping open a file and scanning the pages. Bank accounts, offshore entities, internal memos between people she thought were untouchable. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, from fury, from validation. Why now? She asked without looking at him. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was lower, quieter than she'd ever heard it. Because I was wrong. She turned to face him. I pulled you from the case because I thought I was protecting you, he said. But I wasn't protecting you. I was protecting myself. I was afraid. Afraid of what? She asked, even though she already knew. He looked at her then. Really looked. Of what you make me feel. The air between them cracked open. Not with romance, not with seduction, but with truth. I've spent my entire career removing variables, he continued. People, feelings, risk. I control everything, but I couldn't control you. I couldn't control what I started wanting. And when Maddox touched you, when I saw the possibility that someone else could take what I hadn't even admitted I needed, it ruined me. Zadie swallowed hard, her heart beat thunderous in her chest. You didn't ruin me by pulling me off the case, she said. You ruined me by pretending none of it mattered. I know, he said. That's why I'm here. That's why I've been working in the dark, finding everything they tried to bury. Because this time I'm not walking away, not from the truth, not from you. She stared at him, everything inside her tightening, unraveling, colliding. She should have screamed. She should have told him it was too late. But all she could say was, then let's finish it, together. And just like that, the war between them became a pact. They stayed in that room for hours, shoulder to shoulder, moving through the evidence like a pair of hands meant to work in sync. Rowan stopped trying to control. Zadie stopped trying to resist. And the silence between them no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like a language. When the sun started rising over the city, casting gold across the scattered files, Rowan finally spoke again. I don't care if they come for me, he said, but if they come for you, they won't, she said, interrupting him, because we're going to make sure there's nothing left for them to stand on. He looked at her, not with the cool stare of the CEO, but with something else, something painfully human. Then this isn't just a case anymore, he said. No, Zadie agreed. It's personal now. And it was, for both of them. By the time Friday came, Zadie had barely slept. Her apartment had become a second operations center, every surface covered in documents, laptops, printouts, and scribbled notes. Rowan had been there almost every night for the past 3 days, not as the calculating CEO she'd once known, but as a man unraveling a conspiracy that had lived in his walls for years. She had seen the cracks in his composure grow deeper with each new discovery. But what struck her even more was that he no longer tried to hide them from her. The Rowan who once ruled his world through silence and strategy now spoke to her in the early hours of the morning with quiet confessions and late-night questions, as if her presence offered him a kind of anchoring he hadn't known he needed. Their closeness had evolved into something neither of them tried to name. It wasn't romance, not yet, but it also wasn't just collaboration. It was heavier than that. Raw, a connection forged in secrecy and sharpened by danger. Sometimes their hands brushed as they passed papers between them. Sometimes she caught him staring at her across the desk when she wasn't looking. And sometimes, in the silence between questions, there was nothing but breathing and heat. That morning, she met him at his penthouse instead of the office. He had told her it was safer. Too many eyes on Alaric Holdings now. Too many people watching the building, asking questions, sending emails that didn't look like emails. The kind of surveillance that came from within. Not from enemies, but from insiders who suspected the walls were no longer silent. His penthouse was sleek, cold, and massive. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, dark leather furniture, granite countertops. It looked like it belonged to someone who slept 4 hours a night and didn't believe in art. But now it felt lived in. Coffee cups left on counters, folders stacked in corners, a blanket draped over the back of a couch she'd used when she finally passed out at dawn 2 nights ago. It was no longer a fortress. It was a bunker. The difference mattered. They sat side by side on the floor of his office, papers spread between them. The evidence they had compiled was staggering. Falsified contracts, coded payment structures, backdoor investment links to international shell companies tied to politicians. Even one document that suggested a foreign intelligence connection. At the center of it all, Hollinger Dynamics, but also Gray Maddox. He wasn't just enabling it, he was orchestrating it, and he had help. They're planning to bury this, Zadie said, voice low, reading through a memo from one of the board members. They'll take the fall for a few mid-level execs, shut down a few token departments, rebrand, and move on. Clean hands. Rowan leaned back against the wall, jaw tight. Of course they are, that's how it works. Damage the machine, but never the engine. She turned to look at him. So we break the engine. His gaze met hers. That means going public. She nodded. We have enough to leak to 3 major outlets. We could contact anonymous sources, whistleblower protections. I could lose everything, he said, not as a complaint, but as a fact. She didn't flinch. So could I. He studied her, and for the first time, she didn't see hesitation in his eyes. She saw acceptance. No, he said. You've already lost more than I had the courage to admit. Zadie sat forward, knees drawn to her chest. Then let's stop losing. They devised a plan. 3 outlets, redacted files, sent through different VPNs. One message. This isn't a whistleblower cry for help. It's a reckoning. They included only what they could verify. Double-sourced and protected identities were necessary. Zadie handled the encryption. Rowan prepped the fallback legal statements. He would deny everything if forced, but the trail would lead clearly to Maddox. It would be his ruin. It had to be. That night, after everything was sent, the city felt different, quieter, like it was holding its breath. Zadie stood by the window of the penthouse, arms crossed, watching headlights blur into streaks below. Behind her, Rowan poured them both a drink. Neat whiskey, no ice. He handed her a glass and stood beside her. They'll come for me first, he said. They'll say I turned on my own company. They'll come for both of us, she replied. But they'll never prove we worked together. He glanced sideways. Is that what you want? To be a part in this? She didn't look at him. I want to be safe. That's not the same. Rowan stepped closer, slow and deliberate. You make me want things I'm not supposed to want. Zadie turned her head toward him, her pulse loud in her ears. Like what? He didn't answer immediately. He just looked at her, long and full, as if he were trying to memorize her without needing to touch. Peace, he finally said. A home that isn't empty. Someone who looks at me and doesn't flinch. She took a sip of her drink, then set the glass down, heart hammering. You know, she said softly, for a man who used to say nothing, you say too much now. He stepped even closer. Their bodies nearly touched, but he didn't cross the final line. He stood just at the edge, breathing with her. Say when, he whispered. Zadie reached for his hand and laced her fingers into his. Her voice was steady, but her chest ached. Not yet, she said. But soon. He nodded, and that was enough. They didn't kiss. They didn't fall into bed. They stayed there, shoulder to shoulder, watching the city wait for the storm they had just unleashed. And when the phone rang, just past midnight, they both knew exactly what it meant. The reckoning had begun. The call came from a blocked number, which wasn't unusual in their world. But what followed wasn't routine. It wasn't a legal notice, not a threat masked as courtesy. It was a single sentence spoken in a clipped, anonymous voice that vanished before either of them could respond. You were warned. And then the line went dead. Rowan stood there in the center of his office, the receiver still in his hand, his face unreadable, but his body tense. Zadie watched him closely from the couch, her legs tucked under her, surrounded by files and a laptop still glowing from their final transmission earlier that night. They had sent the evidence. It was done. No more strategizing, no more hiding. They had pulled the trigger and now had no choice but to wait for the consequences. Within an hour, the first headline dropped. It came from an underground investigative outlet known for exposing corporate corruption. A breaking report outlined the shell companies, the laundering, the names, half redacted, half leaked on purpose. It was clear and damning, and while it didn't mention Rowan or Zadie directly, it pointed a neon arrow at Hollinger Dynamics. More stories followed within the next 2 hours, this time from mainstream media. One article mentioned an unnamed senior figure at Alaric Holdings who had cooperated in exposing financial irregularities. Another noted that Gray Maddox's private equity firm had funneled money through at least 5 unregistered foundations in Eastern Europe. No names in bold, no accusations yet, but the direction was clear. Zadie didn't sleep that night. Neither did Rowan. They barely spoke, but neither left the room. They worked in silence, collecting data, documenting reactions, saving screenshots, preserving everything in anticipation of the storm that was already building. And when dawn came, Manhattan looked the same, but they knew the ground under them had shifted forever. When Rowan's phone buzzed again, this time with a number he recognized, he answered without a word. It was Marcus. "They know," Marcus said simply. "There's an emergency board meeting at 10. You're expected." Rowan didn't flinch. "And Maddox? He's already in the building. He's not pretending to play nice anymore." Rowan ended the call and turned to Zadie. She already knew what was coming. "You're not going to that meeting alone," she said before he could speak. "They'll try to spin it, threaten you, isolate you. That's why I have to go alone," he said. "If they think you were part of this, if they know how much of this came from you, they'll bury you." "I'm not scared of them," she said. "I am," he said softly. "I'm scared of what I've dragged you into." She stood and crossed to him, stopping only inches away. "You didn't drag me. I walked in with my eyes open. Don't pretend you did this alone." He stared at her a long moment, then nodded. "Stay here. No matter what happens in that room, wait for my call." She wanted to protest, but she didn't, because she understood. He had to be the one to face them. This part of the war was his. At 10 o'clock sharp, Rowan stepped into the glass boardroom on the top floor of Alaric Holdings. Every board member was present. Gray Maddox sat near the head of the table, relaxed, legs crossed, as if the news coverage had never happened. The room was already thick with accusations and strategic ambiguity. But Rowan didn't sit. He didn't even greet them. He placed a thick folder on the table, copies of the same evidence they had leaked to the press. "This," he said, "is everything you chose to ignore." The room buzzed immediately. Questions, deflections, subtle threats. Some of them leaned into polite concern, trying to probe what he intended. Others demanded explanations, denials, a plan to protect the company's future. But Rowan only looked at Maddox. "You used this company to fund criminal operations," he said, voice level. "You used my name, my resources, my silence." Gray smiled thinly. "You don't have proof that connects me directly." "I don't need proof anymore," Rowan said. "The public doesn't require it to turn." Gray stood slowly, as if the show was over. "Then I suppose this is your resignation." But Rowan didn't move. "No, this is yours." He turned and nodded toward the doorway. Marcus entered a moment later with two corporate security officers. They stepped forward and stopped at Gray's chair. Maddox laughed once, low and bitter, but he didn't resist. As he was escorted out, the board exploded into protest, some shocked, others clearly complicit. Rowan silenced them with a single sentence. "I've filed to dissolve the executive structure pending full internal investigation. Effective immediately, I'm assuming full operational control." It was a bold move, legally dangerous, but it bought time. And more importantly, it bought truth. When Rowan returned to his penthouse that evening, Sadie was sitting on the floor, her back against the window, watching the skyline like it might offer an answer. He dropped his keys and crossed to her in silence. When he sat down beside her, he didn't speak. He just exhaled, long and slow, and let his shoulders drop for the first time in what felt like years. She looked at him. "It's done?" "For now," he said. "The board is fractured. Maddox is out. They'll try to rebuild, but they won't forget what happened." "And you?" she asked. "I'm tired," he admitted, "but not finished." She leaned against him without asking. His arm came around her naturally, not with possession, but with familiarity. Like a man who had finally let someone in. "You saved more than the company," she whispered. He turned his head slightly, resting his chin near her temple. "I didn't save you. You saved me." They sat like that for a long time. No more words needed. The city moved outside, unaware of the war that had just been fought in silence. A war not just of power and corruption, but of two people who had learned how to fight beside each other instead of alone. It wasn't a happy ending. It wasn't even an ending. But it was real, and for them, that was more than enough.